The morning I came back from my fishing trip up near Kenora, my duffel bag was still damp from the rain. I remember thinking I'd have a hot coffee, maybe sit on the back porch and watch the birch trees for a while. 53 years I'd lived in that house. I knew every creak in the floorboards, every draft that came through the kitchen window in January. I knew this house the way I knew my own hands. So when my key slid into the lock and turned nothing, just dead resistance, like pushing against a wall, I stood there on my own front step for a long moment and didn't move. Then I smiled. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my phone. I typed 4 words to my lawyer, Patricia Okafor. They changed the locks. She replied in under a minute, "Perfect, we're ready." I set my bag down, sat on the porch step, and waited. I'd been waiting for 8 months already. A few more minutes didn't bother me at all. My name is Walter Beaumont. I'm 67 years old. I spent 31 years working as a site supervisor for a civil construction company out of Thunder Bay, Ontario. I built roads and bridges for most of my working life. I am not a complicated man. I like fishing. I like woodworking in my garage. And I liked coming home to my wife, Irene, every evening for 41 years. Irene passed away 3 years ago, this past April. Pancreatic cancer. 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end. I won't linger on that because this story isn't about grief, though grief is where everything that followed began. Our house is a 4-bedroom on a half-acre lot on the edge of the city, backing onto a ravine. We bought it in 1991 for $112,000. It appraised last year at just over $700,000. Irene planted every tree in the backyard herself. The Japanese lilac by the fence was her favorite. Every May it bloomed purple, and she'd open the kitchen window just to smell it. After she died, my son Trevor started visiting more often. Trevor is 42 now. He works in real estate investment, or he did, rather. He's charming, well-dressed, drives a lease vehicle that he changes every 2 years. His wife, Donna, has the kind of smile that reaches her eyes only when she thinks something is useful to her. I don't say that to be cruel. I say it because it's accurate, and because over the course of this story, accuracy matters. At first, the visits were welcome. We'd have dinner. We'd sit at the kitchen table where his mother used to sit. He'd ask how I was sleeping, whether I was keeping up with the yard, whether I'd thought about the future. I thought he was being a good son. I told my neighbor, Bill Haverstock, we've been friends for 30 years. Bill and I told him, Trevor had really come through since losing his mother. Bill looked at me sideways and said, "Has he asked you about the house yet?" I told him no. Bill said, "He will." I thought Bill was being cynical. Bill tends toward cynicism. I told him so. It started in small ways, the way these things always do. Trevor began mentioning the stairs. "Dad, those stairs are steep. You're not as young as you were." He'd point out the snow on the driveway after a storm. "That's a lot of shoveling for one person, Dad. A lot of liability if someone slips." He brought Donna along to one dinner, and halfway through the roast chicken, she said, very gently, that they'd been looking at some lovely retirement communities north of the city. Independent living, she called it. Totally your own space, but with support nearby. She laid a brochure on the table between the salt shaker and the gravy boat, like it was just a casual thing, an afterthought. I looked at that brochure, and then I looked at my son. "I'll think about it," I said. I didn't think about it, but I started paying closer attention. Over the next few weeks, I noticed things I'd been too charitable to notice before. Trevor had begun copying himself on my bank statements. I'd made that arrangement 2 years earlier when my back was bad, and I needed him to help manage some bills. A temporary arrangement, I'd thought. He'd never removed himself. He started asking questions about the mortgage. There wasn't one. The house had been paid off since 2008, and about Irene's estate, which had been settled and was not complicated. He asked once, almost in passing, whether I had a financial power of attorney in place. I said I didn't, not yet. He said I really ought to get one sorted out, just for peace of mind, Dad, just so there's someone who can act if anything happens to you. I said I'd look into it. What I actually did was call Patricia Okafor. Patricia had been my lawyer for 16 years. She handled the house purchase in 2007 when we refinanced, and she drew up Irene's will. She's direct, thorough, and the kind of person who uses plain language because she respects you enough not to hide behind jargon. I sat in her office on a Tuesday afternoon in early October and laid out everything I'd observed over the past 2 months, the copies of the bank statements, the the brochure, the questions about the power of attorney. The shift in Trevor's manner, not dramatic, not cartoonishly suspicious, just a slow reorientation, the way a satellite dish turns toward a signal. Patricia listened without interrupting. Then she asked, "Do you think he would actually try to do something?" I said I didn't know, but I said I'd rather find out with a safety net than without one. She nodded. "Then let's build one." What she proposed was careful and legal and took several months to execute properly. First, she helped me establish a revocable living trust with myself as the primary trustee and my younger brother, Douglas, in Sudbury, as the successor trustee. The house was transferred into the trust. This meant that no one, not Trevor, not anyone acting on Trevor's behalf, could sell, mortgage, or otherwise transfer the house without going through the trust structure and through Douglas. The transfer was registered with the Land Titles Office. It was entirely real, entirely binding, and entirely invisible to Trevor. Second, Patricia advised me to change nothing outwardly. Keep the same routines. Don't confront Trevor. If he asked about the power of attorney again, say I was still thinking about it. Third, and this took some convincing on Patricia's part, I agreed to open a separate account at a different bank that Trevor had no access to or knowledge of. I moved the bulk of my savings there quietly over several weeks. I want to be clear about something. I did not enjoy any of this. I am not a man who likes deception, even defensive deception. Every time I sat across from my son at that kitchen table and smiled and nodded while knowing what I knew, something in me felt the weight of it. This was my boy. I taught him to skate on the rink behind the community center. I drove him to hockey practice at 5:30 in the morning for 9 years. When he was 14 and terrified before his first job interview at the grocery store, I sat with him the night before and told him the worst they could say was no. But I also knew that what I was watching was not new behavior. It was old behavior in a new costume. Trevor had borrowed money from us twice before, once in his 20s for a failed restaurant venture, once in his mid-30s when his first investment partnership dissolved badly. Both times, Irene and I had helped without condition. Both times, the money had never been discussed again, except once, obliquely, when Irene mentioned it, and Trevor had gone very quiet and changed the subject. I had been generous my whole life. I didn't regret that. But generosity had not taught Trevor what I'd hoped it would. In November, I told Trevor I was planning to visit my brother Douglas in Sudbury for 2 weeks around Christmas. This was true. Douglas and I had already arranged it. I mentioned, while Trevor was helping himself to more coffee in my kitchen, that I'd thought more about the power of attorney and that maybe he was right, that it made sense to get something in place. Trevor set his mug down very carefully. I said I hadn't done anything about it yet, but I was going to make some calls in the new year. He said that was very sensible, Dad. Very responsible. I watched his face while he said it. I went to Sudbury for Christmas. Douglas knows everything. Douglas is one of the 2 people in my life, along with Patricia, who I trusted with the full picture. He is 70 years old, a retired high school principal, and the least easily rattled person I have ever met. We had a good Christmas. We talked about Irene, which we both needed. We watched hockey. We took the dog for walks in the cold. When I came home in January, everything in the house looked exactly the same. I checked, carefully, for anything out of place. Nothing obvious. But when I opened my laptop and logged into the land registry website, I'd set up an alert months earlier. On Patricia's advice, there was a notification. Someone had conducted a search on my property. A real estate agent named Kayla Norwood, operating through a brokerage I didn't recognize, had pulled the title on my property 3 days before Christmas. I forwarded the notification to Patricia. She called me within an hour. "Walter," she said, "I think we're getting close." In February, Trevor called me and asked if he could come by for dinner. He had something he wanted to discuss. He sounded careful on the phone, not warm. Exactly, but careful. The way a person sounds when they've rehearsed what they're going to say. He came on a Thursday evening. He brought Donna. She brought a bottle of wine, which told me this was intended to feel like a significant occasion. Over dinner, they made their case. The yard was too much work. The house was too large for one person. The market was exceptionally strong right now. Did I know that a place 3 streets over had just sold for $740? I was sitting on a tremendous asset. They had connections in real estate. Trevor gestured here in a way meant to suggest this was incidental, just a side note, and they could handle everything. The listing, the showings, the negotiations, the paperwork. I wouldn't have to do a thing. And the retirement community they'd been looking at, they'd reserved a spot. On my behalf, as it happened, they'd put down a deposit. Just to hold it, they said. No pressure. I sat with my hands around my coffee cup, and I let them talk. When they finished, I said that I appreciated them looking out for me, and that I'd think about everything very carefully. Trevor looked relieved. Donna looked at Trevor. After they left, I called Patricia and told her everything that had been said. She asked me if I thought they'd make a move without my signature. I said I didn't know what Trevor thought he had, but I suspected he was about to find out. In March, I told Trevor I was going on a fishing trip up to Kenora with Bill Haverstock and 2 other men we'd known for years. This was true. The trip had been planned since January. I told Trevor that while I was gone, he could feel free to have Kayla Norwood. I watched his face very carefully when I said that name, do a walkthrough of the house if it would help him understand the property better. The hesitation lasted only a second. He said he didn't know anyone by that name. I said that was fine. I must have been thinking of someone else. I said I'd be back the following Sunday. I left on a Thursday morning. I parked my truck at Bill's place 4 blocks away, and Bill drove both of us to the lake. I had installed a simple security camera system in October, with Douglas's help, when I'd been in Sudbury. The feed went to my phone. On Saturday afternoon, 2 days into my trip, my phone showed me my son letting himself into my house with the spare key I'd given him for emergencies years ago. He was not alone. Kayla Norwood was with him, and another person I didn't recognize, who had the efficient manner of a real estate photographer. They spent 2 hours in the house. They photographed every room. I watched all of it from a campsite on the shore of a lake in northwestern Ontario. Bill sat across the fire from me and didn't ask what I was looking at on my phone. He knew I'd tell him when I was ready. 2 days later, I came home. My key didn't fit the lock. I sat on that front step for about 20 minutes before Trevor's car pulled up. He got out looking confident, slightly flushed, like a man who has done something he knows is wrong but has convinced himself it was necessary. Donna stayed in the car. He stood at the bottom of the porch steps and told me that he and Donna had made a very difficult decision. That they'd listed the house just to test the market, he said, just to see, and that an offer had come in quickly, and that it was a strong offer, and that this was truly the best thing for everyone. He said he'd used a power of attorney. I asked him what power of attorney. He said the one I'd signed last autumn. I looked at him for a long moment. I told him I had never signed a power of attorney. The confidence on his face shifted, just slightly, like a light going behind a cloud. He said that I had. He said I'd been confused lately, that I'd forgotten things, that this was part of why they were worried about me. I nodded slowly. I said, Trevor, I want you to know that I love you. That will always be true. I paused. I also want you to tell me exactly which document you believe you have and where you believe this sale currently stands. He told me. An offer had been accepted not by me, but by a fraudulent document he had apparently arranged with the help of a notary I had never met for $690,000. Closing was in 60 days. I took out my phone and dialed Patricia. She answered immediately. I said, Patricia, the offer has been accepted at $690, closing 60 days. I heard her write it down. She said, I'll file everything this afternoon. Trevor's face had gone very still. I stood up from the step, picked up my duffel bag, and said, I'm going inside now. You should call your own lawyer, son, tonight. What followed was not simple, and I won't pretend it was. These things are never simple when they involve your own family. Patricia filed an immediate injunction to halt the sale. Because the house was held in a trust that Trevor had no authority over, a trust he apparently hadn't known about, because you cannot find a trust through a standard title search, the way you can find a registered owner, the buyer's lawyer, who was legitimate and acting in good faith, had missed it. The injunction went through. The sale was frozen. The fraudulent power of attorney was investigated. The notary who had witnessed it, a man named Gerald Palfrey, who operated a small office on the south side of the city, faced his own regulatory and legal consequences, as he should have. The Ontario police were involved. Trevor was charged with fraud over $5,000, forgery, and uttering a forged document. Donna was not charged. The investigation found no evidence of her direct involvement in the document forgery, though she had clearly known about the plan. The charge of complicity was explored and ultimately not pursued for lack of sufficient evidence. The buyer lost no money. The sale was voided properly through legal channels, and the buyer received their deposit back in full within 2 weeks. I want to say that clearly because that buyer was an innocent party and deserved to be protected. The case took 14 months to resolve. Trevor pleaded guilty to the forgery charge in exchange for a suspended sentence, probation, and 200 hours of community service. He was also ordered to pay my legal costs, which were considerable. I did not attend the sentencing. I didn't think I could sit in that courtroom and watch my son read a statement to a judge. I stayed home and went out to the garage and worked on a cedar chest I'd been building for Douglas's granddaughter. I still live in this house. I turned 67 last September. The Japanese lilac bloomed again this past May. I opened the kitchen window, the way Irene always did, and I stood there for a while. Trevor and I have not spoken since the day on the front step. I wrote him a letter 6 months after the sentencing. A real letter, 3 pages, handwritten. I told him what his childhood had meant to me. I told him I understood something about desperation, that I knew his business had been failing, and that he'd been in serious debt, and that fear does things to people they sometimes can't see clearly. I told him that my door was not permanently closed, but that it would require time and honesty, and real change, not a transaction, not a conversation designed to get something. Real change. He has not written back. That's his choice to make. I hope he makes a different one someday. I won't be waiting by the mailbox, but I won't be throwing away hope either. Bill Haverstock came over last month. We sat on the back porch with 2 beers and watched a pair of cedar waxwings in the lilac tree. Bill said, "You know, most people wouldn't have handled it that way. Most people would have blown up the minute they saw that camera footage." I told him that's the thing about working in construction for 30 years. You learn to build the structure before you start the work. You don't start swinging a hammer before the foundation is set. He said that was either very wise or just too much time spent on job sites. I told him probably both. If you are older, and you live alone, and you have people around you asking careful questions about your property, and your finances, and your capacity, please listen to that feeling of unease. You are allowed to be cautious. You are allowed to seek independent legal advice without telling the people around you that you're doing it. You are allowed to set up structures that protect what you've built. A revocable living trust costs a few $100s and an afternoon in a lawyer's office. A separate bank account costs nothing. An automated land title alert is free. These are not complicated things. They are simply things that most people don't know they can do until it's too late. This is not a story about hating your children or assuming the worst of everyone who cares about you. Most families are not like this. Most children are not like Trevor. But the ones who are the ones who confuse love with access, who mistake your trust for an open door, they count on you not knowing your options. Know your options. Talk to a lawyer you trust before you ever talk to a family member about money. Your home is not just an asset. For most of us, it is the place where our whole life happened. It is worth protecting with the same care you used to build it. I'm still building, still working in the garage, still walking to Bill's place on Friday evenings, still watching those waxwings in May. 67 years old, and the foundation is solid. That's everything worth knowing.